The card game had been going since 8 o'clock, and it was past midnight when her husband lost her. And the losing of it was done so quietly that she almost did not understand what had happened until the man across the table from Frank Deal looked up at her where she stood in the doorway of the back room of Cutter's Saloon and smiled the particular smile of a man who has just acquired something. Her name was Lena Deal, and she had come to Cutter's because Frank had not come home. And Frank not coming home when money was involved meant Frank was at a card table. And Frank at a card table when money was involved meant she needed to know how bad it was before the morning made it worse. She had learned this in 4 years of marriage to a man whose charm was genuine, and whose judgment was poor, and whose relationship with money was the relationship of a person who believed the next hand was always going to be better than the last one. It had not been better. It had been, on the whole, considerably worse, and she had been managing the consequences of that with the books she kept, and the garden she ran, and the sewing she took in, for most of the 4 years. She had not known, standing in the doorway of the back room, that Frank had run out of money an hour before, and had kept playing anyway, and that the thing he had put into the pot to keep playing with was her. Not her in the way the law would recognize. Frank Deal was not a sophisticated man, but he was not a fool either, and he understood that a man cannot legally wager his wife at a card table. What he had wagered was her service, her labor. 3 years of her cooking and housekeeping and whatever else the winner might find useful, which was language Frank had used and which she would come to know when Frank tried to explain it to her later, and the whatever else was the part she would not hear past. Because whatever else in the mouth of a man who had just lost her in a card game to another man who was smiling across a table meant one thing, and it was not dishes and laundry. The man smiling across the table was named Cal Veach, and he was big through the chest and easy in his manner, and he had the eyes of a person who has decided what a thing is worth and is patient about collecting it, and he was looking at her with the comfortable expectation of a man who has won a hand and expects the winnings to be delivered. She looked back at him with the flat attention she used for things that wanted to intimidate her. There were 3 other men at the table. She registered them in her peripheral attention the way she registered anything in a room, without looking directly. 2 of them were looking at the table. The third was not. The third was looking at Cal Veach with an expression that was not comfortable. And when Veach reached toward the pot with the expectation of a man collecting what he was owed, the third man stood up. He was not large. He was lean and weathered and quiet in the way of a person who has learned that the quality of a thing is not determined by the noise it makes. And he stood up from the table with the unhurried certainty of a man who has already decided what he is going to do, and is doing it. He did not push his chair back loudly. He did not set his jaw or raise his shoulders, or do any of the things men do when they want the room to understand they are angry. He simply stood, and the standing itself was enough to stop Veach's hand halfway to the pot, because there was something in the way he occupied the space that communicated without any of the usual signals that he was not going to sit back down until the thing was resolved. Deal's not done. His name was Seb Crail, and he had been in Cutter's that evening for the same reason most working men ended up in Cutter's on a Thursday, which was that the day had been long and the night had nowhere better to go. He ran a horse operation 12 miles north of Granger's Crossing, and he came to town on Thursdays for supply, and stayed sometimes into the evening and occasionally into the night, and he had sat down at the table in the back room because there was a seat and he had money he could afford to lose, and the game had seemed ordinary. It had not remained ordinary. He did not know Lena Deal. He knew Frank Deal the way everyone in Granger's Crossing knew Frank Deal, which was by reputation, and the reputation was of a man who was likable and unreliable in equal measure. He did not know the woman in the doorway at all. What he knew was what he had seen, which was a man put his wife's labor into a pot, and a man across the table collected with a smile that said the labor was not what he was collecting. And he had looked at the 2 other men at the table and seen them finding things to examine on the felt. And he had understood that the only person in the room who was going to say anything about it was him, and he had stood up. Deal's not done. He kept his voice even and his eyes on Veach. Frank Deal can't stake what isn't his to stake. Veach looked at him with the measuring attention of a man deciding whether the obstacle in front of him is worth the trouble of removing it. He was big through the chest and comfortable with being big, and he had the calculation behind his eyes of a man who has won a great many rooms by being the largest presence in them. She's his wife. His to manage as he sees fit. Seb held Beach's gaze without adjustment. She's a person, not a pot, not a stake, not a service contract. He moved his gaze to Frank, who had the expression of a man who has done a thing and is only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he has done. You call the hand void, or you play me for it. Straight draw one hand, your debt against mine. He reached into his coat and put money on the table, more than the pot held, without counting it out because he had already counted it in his head, and the number was right. He met Frank's eyes. You win, your debt's cleared, and the night ends here. I win. The hand with Beach is void, and your wife goes home. The room was quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something has happened that everyone understands is larger than the occasion that produced it. Frank Deal looked at the money. Frank Deal looked at his wife in the doorway. Frank Deal looked at the cards in his hand with the expression of a man who has been a bad gambler his entire life and knows it and cannot stop. And he made the decision that a bad gambler always makes when there is money on the table, which was to play. He lost. Seb Crail raked nothing toward himself. He left the money on the table for Frank to clear his debts with, because the money had been the stake, and the stake was Frank's obligation, not his prize, and he pushed his chair back and stood and looked at Lena Deal in the doorway and said the only other thing he said to her that night. Your husband's debts are cleared, you can go home. Then he put on his hat and walked out of the back room of Cutter's Saloon and into the Granger's Crossing night, and Lena stood in the doorway a moment longer and looked at the money on the table and at her husband's face and at the door the man had walked out of, and she felt several things in a sequence that she could not have organized into words. The last of which was the particular cold clarity of a woman who has just watched her husband wager her at a card table and understood in the same moment that the understanding was the end of something she had been pretending was not already over. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who stood in doorways and understood everything at once. Men who stood up from a card table for a person they had never met because the alternative was to sit down and be the kind of man they had no intention of being. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now. Then, back to the story. She did not go home with Frank that night. She went to her mother's house, which was 2 streets from Cutter's, and which her mother had kept for her through 4 years of marriage to Frank Deal, with the patient love of a woman who has seen a thing coming and is making sure the door is unlocked when it arrives. Her mother asked no questions. She put the kettle on and went to bed, and left Lena at the kitchen table with the tea and the cold clarity and the 4 years arranging themselves in her mind in the order that 4 years arrange themselves when you are finally letting yourself look at them directly. She had married Frank for the reasons women marry men whose charm is genuine even when their judgment is poor. Which was that the charm was real and the love it produced was real, and the understanding that a person can love a thing and also be destroyed by it is not always available at the age of 22 when the charm is working and the judgments. Failures have not yet compounded to the point of a card table at midnight. She had known for 2 years that the marriage was a failing enterprise. She had been managing its failure the way she managed everything, with books and discipline and the daily work of keeping what could be kept from going under. She had not let herself admit that what she was keeping from going under was not the marriage, but herself. The card table had done her the service of making it impossible to pretend otherwise. She began the legal process that week, which was the process of annulment in the county of Granger's Crossing, Wyoming, which required documentation of specific grounds and a petition to the county court, and the better part of 4 months before a judge would see it. The grounds she had were the wagering which her mother's neighbor had witnessed from the doorway of the saloon before Lena arrived, and 2 years of documented financial misconduct she had in her own account books, because she had been keeping the household accounts, and therefore knew precisely what Frank had spent, and on what and when. She had not been keeping them for this purpose. She had been keeping them because the money had to be managed, and Frank could not manage it. And now they were the most useful thing she owned, which was, she thought, the way it always went with good books. She filed the petition. She went back to the house and took the account books and her grandmother's quilt and the sewing kit and the seeds she had saved for spring planting, and she left Frank the furniture and the debt and the charm which was all he had ever really had and all he had ever really needed, from a world that kept forgiving him for it. Frank stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched her pack with the expression of a man who has finally understood the full shape of what he has done and is hoping even now that the expression will be enough to undo it. It was not enough. She had spent 4 years watching that expression do its work, and she was no longer susceptible to it. She took a room above the dry goods, and she took in sewing, and she organized the 4 months of the annulment process the way she organized everything, as a set of tasks with a sequence and a completion. The task in the first month was to have the petition properly filed and the documentation in order. The task in the second month was to appear before the county clerk and submit the account book records that showed the financial misconduct, which she had organized with the same care she organized all books, entries dated and cross-referenced and annotated where the pattern would not be self-evident to someone reading them for the first time. The clerk had looked at the records for a long time and then looked at her and said her documentation was the clearest he had seen in an annulment petition, and she had said thank you and meant it as information rather than comfort. Because what it told her was that the books were going to hold and the petition was going to succeed, and the task in the 3rd and 4th months was therefore patience. She was good at patience. She had been practicing it for 4 years. She did not think about the man who had stood up from the card table, because thinking about him would have been a thing she was doing for the wrong reasons at the wrong time, and she was done doing things for wrong reasons. She thought about him anyway. She was honest enough with herself to know that she did. Not often, and not in the way she would have thought about him if the timing had been different, but in the specific way you think about a person who did a thing that mattered and whom you have no way of thanking, which is with the particular unresolved quality of an account that has not been settled. She learned his name from the dry goods woman, who knew everyone's name and business and was generous with both. Seb Krail. Horse operation, 12 miles north. Comes to town on Thursdays. She did not go looking for him on a Thursday. She told herself she would not, and she did not. She had 4 months of legal process and a room above the dry goods, and enough sewing to keep the accounts from going red, and that was sufficient, and she did not add variables she was not ready to manage. He found her on a Thursday in the 2nd month. Tell me when he stood up from that table and said, "Deal's not done." Did you feel the full weight of what it cost a man who did not know her to put his own money on the table for a stranger? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Now back to the story. He came into the dry goods for feed orders, as he apparently did most Thursdays, and she was at the counter going over the month's sewing accounts with the dry goods woman when he came in, and there was a moment in which all 3 of them understood who was in the room, and the dry goods woman found a reason to go to the back, and the 2 of them were left at the counter with the sewing accounts between them. He looked at the accounts on the counter. He looked at her. "You're doing the books here now." Her own. She straightened the pages with the habit of a person who keeps things in order. "I take in sewing. I track my own accounts." He nodded. He looked at the window and then back at her, with the directness she remembered from the back room of Cutter's, the quality of a man who looked at things fully rather than sideways. "Are you all right?" "Better than I was 2 months ago." She held his gaze without difficulty. "I've filed for annulment. It will take another 2 months at least." He was quiet a moment. Then he said he was glad she had filed, plainly and without addition, which was how she had already understood he said things. "I've been wanting to thank you." She said it straight, without the softening that would have made it a social pleasantry instead of the true thing she meant. "What you did at Cutter's. I don't know how to repay it. It doesn't want repaying." His voice held the same evenness it had held across the card table. "I put money on the table and I won the hand." That was all it was. It was not all it was, and they both knew it. And she let the knowing sit in the space between them without dressing it. "You lost money to clear his debts. You didn't have to. The money wasn't even part of the original situation. You put it in to give him a way to play his way out, and if he'd won, you'd have lost it for nothing. He looked at her steadily. If he'd won, you'd have gone home free of the debt, and Veach would have had no claim, and the night would have ended cleanly. He paused. That was worth the money either way. She looked at him. She was by profession and by disposition a person who assessed figures, and she was assessing this one. He had framed the bet as a clean outcome regardless of who won, which was the framing of a person who had not gone to the table to win money, but to create a situation in which a wrong thing could not proceed. The money had been the instrument, not the point. She had understood that in the back room at Cutter's, and she understood it more clearly standing at the dry goods counter, and she filed it in the same place she filed the things she intended to think about carefully. He looked at the counter. I don't do well with sitting still when a thing is wrong. He paused. It's a quality that gets me into occasional difficulty. She almost smiled. She had not almost smiled at anything in 2 months. It was a disorienting sensation, like a window opening in a room that had been shut all winter, and she did not quite know what to do with it. And so she let it be there and did not try to manage it, which was itself a departure from her usual practice. He came back on the following Thursday. He did not have an obvious reason for coming back. The feed order was a monthly arrangement, and he had placed it the week before. But he came in and stood at the counter, and they talked in the spare way that she was coming to understand was his register. Nothing unnecessary. Everything meant. He asked about the annulment process without asking about it, which was to say he asked how things were going in the way that contained the question without pressing it. And she told him they were going the way legal processes went, which was slowly and on their own schedule. And he nodded, and that was all. And the conversation went elsewhere. She found that she was not manufacturing reasons to extend it because it did not require manufacturing. It was simply the most comfortable 12 minutes she had spent in 2 months. And when he left, she went back to her accounts with the specific awareness of a woman who has decided not to think about something that she is thinking about. He came back the Thursday after that. This time there was something that might have been a pretext, a question about whether the dry goods stocked a particular grade of fence wire, and the dry goods woman answered him, and he stayed at the counter afterward anyway and talked to Lena about the horse operation in the spare, informational way he talked about everything. And she listened with the attention she gave things she wanted to understand. And she found she was filing what he told her the way she filed ledger entries, with the intention of building toward a full picture. He was not a man who performed his own competence. He simply described what the work required and how he did it, and the description was its own form of honesty. He came back the Thursday after that. The dry goods woman said nothing, and her eyes said everything, and Lena decided to find this useful rather than annoying because the alternative was to be embarrassed about something that was not embarrassing, and she had used up her patience for unnecessary embarrassment in 4 years of Frank. By the 4th Thursday, she knew the shape of him, the way she came to know the things she needed to understand. From the outside in. He had taken on the horse operation 3 years before from an uncle who had let it run down, and he had built it back by the method of doing the work correctly and not spending past what it earned, which was the only method that actually worked and the one most people found least attractive. He had no family nearby. He read when he could get books, which was not often enough to suit him. He had, in the back room of Cutter's saloon, put 3 months of operating cash on a card table for a woman he had never met, because the alternative was to watch something wrong happen, and he was not constituted for that. And he had come back to the dry goods 4 Thursdays in a row without being asked and without a convincing pretext, which was its own form of information. And she was a person who read information carefully. The annulment came through on a Friday in the 4th month, and it came with the particular weight of a legal document that closes one thing and opens another, and she sat with it at the table in the room above the dry goods for a long time before she put it in the account book where she kept the important papers. And she felt, setting it between the pages, not the grief she had expected, but the specific sensation of a column that has been carried wrong for a long time, finally being corrected. Seb came on the Thursday after, which was now the Thursday in the first week of her life that contained nothing she was legally bound to that she had not chosen, and she had the annulment paper in the account book and the account book on the counter, and when he came in, she looked at him and said it plainly. The annulment came through last Friday. He was still for a moment. Then he said he was glad, and the way he said it was different from 2 months before in the dry goods, fuller in the word, the way a word sounds when a man has been saving it for the version he actually means. She looked at the account book. "I've been doing your books this season." He looked at her. "I haven't asked you to." "You haven't." She opened the cover. "But I know what a horse operations accounts look like, and yours were coming through in the supply orders, and I could see the Q2 feed cost was running against the price you'd get for the September horses, and I did the figures." She turned the book so the page faced him. "You're buying hay from the Kettner farm when the Aldous farm 2 miles further is 20 cents cheaper per ton at the same quality. Over a full year, that's the difference between a thin margin and a sound one." She kept her voice level and informational, the way she presented all figures. "I didn't do it to insert myself into your business. I did it because I'm a person who sees an inefficiency and can't leave it alone." He looked at the figures. He looked at her. His eyes held something that was not about the hay price. "That's my feed cost." His voice was careful and exact. "How long have you been doing my accounts?" 6 weeks. She held his gaze steadily. "Since the 4th Thursday." He was quiet for a moment in the way that she understood was not the absence of thought. And then he said he would want to see the full ledger, and she said she had it, and he said he had time now if she had time, and she said she did. And they sat at the counter in the dry goods on a Thursday afternoon and went through 6 weeks of figures she had been keeping for him, without permission. And he did not argue with a single entry, and he changed nothing, and he asked 3 questions that told her he understood exactly what he was reading, and when they were done, he closed the book and put his hands flat on the counter and looked at it. "You've been doing this for 6 weeks." "I have." "Why?" She looked at him. The honest answer or the useful one, he looked up at her. The honest one. She gave it to him. "Because you put 3 months of operating cash on a card table for a woman you did not know, and you never asked for it back, and you never asked for anything at all, and I am a person who keeps accounts, and I had a debt on my books that I could not settle in money." She paused. "So I settled it in the only currency I had." She held his gaze. "And because after the 4th Thursday I was keeping them for a different reason as well. And I'm aware of the difference, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He was very still. The dry goods woman had gone somewhere extremely quiet in the back and was staying there. Seb looked at the account book and then at the woman who had kept it for him for 6 weeks for reasons that had started as a debt and become something else. He said her name once, the careful first time. The way a man says a word he has been holding and is now letting out of his hands. She waited. "I would like to offer you a position." He kept his voice plain and direct. "Not a housekeeper's position and not a debt repayment and not anything that has a contract attached to it because you've had enough of those." He looked at her. "I run a horse operation that needs someone to run the books, and I've been running them badly. Which your 6 weeks have made clear to me. I'd pay a fair wage, and there'd be no confusion about what the arrangement is or isn't." He paused. "And I would like, when the time is right and not before, and only if it is something you want, to ask you something beyond the arrangement." He met her eyes steadily. "Not now. Now is too soon, and you have just come out of something that deserves more space than a month. But I want you to know the question is there, so that you can decide whether you want to work for a man who is going to ask it." Lena stood at the counter in the dry goods on a Thursday afternoon with the account book she had been keeping for 6 weeks between her hands and looked at the man who had stood up from a card table for a stranger at midnight and spent 3 months of cash to make a wrong thing stop and had never once asked to be thanked for it. She thought about 4 years of Frank and the card table and the cold clarity of a backroom doorway. She had been managing Frank's failures for long enough that she had confused the managing with the marriage. Had told herself that keeping the books and the household and the accounts from going under was the same as keeping the marriage alive, and the card table had made the distinction impossible to avoid. You could not manage a man back into someone he was not. You could keep the numbers from going red, but you could not manufacture the fundamental quality that Frank Deal had never had, which was the understanding that the people in his life were not resources to be deployed when the resources ran low. She thought about 4 months in a room above the dry goods, with the annulment in her account book, and the sewing on the table, and 12 Thursdays that had reorganized themselves without her permission into the thing she was standing in now. She had not looked for this. She had come out of 4 years and a backroom doorway and a county court process with the firm intention of being sufficient to herself for as long as she needed to be. And she had meant it, and she had been it, and 12 Thursdays had happened anyway, which was not the same as being swept away by a thing. It was more like being presented with evidence until the evidence was too clear to continue not seeing it. She thought about the question that was there but was not yet being asked, and about a man who had said so explicitly because he understood that the difference between a question offered too soon and a question offered at the right time was the difference between the two kinds of pressure. And she had been under enough pressure. That understanding on its own was its own form of answer. A man who understood the weight of too soon was a man who had been paying attention, and a man who had been paying attention was a man whose attention was worth something. She thought about what she wanted, directly and without the management she had been applying to the wanting for 4 months. It was not complicated. It was the simplest thing. It was clean accounts and honest work, and a man who had demonstrated at a card table in a back room at midnight the kind of person he was under conditions that cost him something. That was the kind of demonstration a woman who had spent 4 years managing a man's unreliability learned to value above almost anything else. Not the charm, not the promise. The demonstration made in public before he knew her name, when there was no reason to make it except that it was the right thing, and he was the kind of man who did the right thing when it cost him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said it the way she put down a figure that had been calculated and verified and was ready to hold. The position is, yes, the question that's there, but isn't asked yet. That's yes, too, when the time is right. She held his gaze. "You stood up from a table for me when you didn't know my name. I can tell you the answer to both things on the same Thursday." As if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. Seb Crail. Her name for him. The first time. The word finding the place it was made for and settling there, plain and permanent. Then once more differently, the way a word sounds when a woman has been saying it in her own head and has finally let it into the room. He nodded once. The matter was closed. He picked up the account book and held it with the care of a man who understood what had gone into it, and he said he would like to take it back to the ranch so he could finish reading it tonight. And she said that was fine, and he said he would be back next Thursday, and she said she knew, and he put his hat on and walked out into the Granger's Crossing afternoon, and she stood at the counter and watched the door and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the particular sensation of an account that had been carried wrong, coming finally, completely right. She had stood in the doorway of a back room and watched her husband wager her at a card table, and a man she had never met had stood up and said the deal was not done, and put his own money on the table to prove it, and the deal had not been done, and the night had not ended the way Frank Deal had expected, and the 4 years had not ended the way she had feared, and 12 Thursdays later she was standing in a dry goods store on the other side of the only legal document that had ever truly served her, with her accounts in order and her name her own, and a man who had demonstrated his character at midnight, under conditions that cost him something, and had been coming back every Thursday since he had not won her at a card table. That was the thing she would want to be clear about. In the years after, when people who had heard the story told it the way people told stories, with the romance in front and the truth somewhere behind it, he had not won her. He had stopped a wrong thing from proceeding, and then he had come to the dry goods on Thursdays and talked to her like a person while she worked her way through a legal process and organized her own life back into something that was actually hers. And by the time she kept his books for 6 weeks without being asked, and he asked the question he had been holding, she was not a woman who was being won. She was a woman who had decided clearly and on her own terms, with clean books and 12 Thursdays and the full picture she had been building since the first time she filed a ledger entry under a stranger's name, and the deciding was the whole of it. The card table was the beginning of the story. It was not the story. The story was the ground that came after it. The weeks of ordinary work and spare conversation, and the account carried correctly for the first time in 4 years. And the ground was hers, and she was not going anywhere. He stood up from the card table for a stranger and said, "Deal's not done." By the time she knew what that meant, it was already the truest thing anyone had said about her in 4 years, and the account she owed on it had taken 6 weeks of ledgers and 1 Thursday afternoon to settle. And neither of them called it settled because a thing like that does not settle so much as it becomes the ground you stand on. And the ground had been built correctly from the first entry, and it would hold, and she was not going anywhere, and the books were in order, and the next Thursday was coming, and that was everything.